Thank you, Holly, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of the board and the staff of the Saskatchewan Seniors Mechanism, welcome to our webinar, Rethinking Care for Older Adults. My name is Randy Dove, as just mentioned. I'm the president of the SSM, and it is my honor to start this important event. As we start, I would also acknowledge that the land from where this webinar originates is on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples and the homeland of the Métis. We're really delighted to see the turnout this morning. Just looking at the bottom of my screen, it's moving between 80, 82 participants. And so that's terrific. And as I look around the screen, I see many familiar faces. So again, welcome. Today is an important part of the work that SSM has been leading for over 2 years in building awareness and understanding about the needs and issues of older adults in Saskatchewan. Our effort is to continue to work towards commitment and action to focus on positive aging. It's a result of consultation with over 600 people, a survey of over 2,000 people who responded, an ongoing dialogue with our 18 member organizations, our 7 supporter organizations, and our partnership with the municipalities of Saskatchewan. With the pandemic, it's become clear that there are significant issues related to the care industry as it's overdue for an overhaul of the approaches for caring for older adults. Those of you that are on this webinar from Saskatchewan may have seen yesterday and today and again tomorrow, articles that are now appearing in both the Leader Post and the Star Phoenix related to care in Saskatchewan. I think the timing is rather convenient for us to have this webinar at the same time, and that's just, I suspect, better luck than good planning, but in any event, that's good. So in our promotional poster, we added the subtitle, See the Familiar with New Eyes. So we'd ask you to participate today and focus on creative ways to rethink the needs for care for our aging population. And to start off the morning, we have a really dynamic presentation from 2 excellent resources and friends of SSM. So I want to introduce in no particular order, but I will go traditionally and go ladies first. So I will introduce Shan Landry, one of our SSM directors, a member of the Saskatchewan Long-Term Care Network, and a longtime advocate for change related to older adults in Saskatchewan. And Dr. Dennis Kendel is with us, well known as a health policy consultant who's worked in health policy area for many years, insights and views on how to better the health system in Saskatchewan and across Canada. So again, thank you for joining us for this webinar. There'll be lots of opportunities for participation as we move through the roughly 90 minutes. And we do encourage you to participate, enjoy the time together. I know there's for both information related to the sessions and just plain opportunities to say hello to each other. You can use the chat function on the side and make sure that we have a little bit of fun as we go through this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shan and Dennis to lead on. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Randy. And going with the ladies first, I'm going to do a little bit more introduction, both of myself and Dennis, and then say a few words before we get into what we had planned to call a conversation between the two of us. Rather than me just firing questions off or Dennis challenging me only, we thought it would be a good opportunity for there to be some give and take. But as you heard from the introduction, I'm a member of the SSM board. I have a connection with the Saskatchewan Long-Term Care Network and a long-time association with the Saskatoon Council on Aging. But there's 2 other things I thought I would mention personally. One of them is that for 4 years, I was the biggest caregiver for my mother, who was a resident in long-term care. She died in 2019. And also in my working career, much of my time was spent in community care, looking at things to do with home care, long-term care. So I feel like I come at this subject today with a great passion, be based on my past experience and also what I can see coming ahead. I want to introduce a longtime colleague of mine, Dennis Kendel, and add a little bit to what Randy had said about Dennis. And although I've known Dennis well for a long time and could probably just speak at you his history, I'm going to read the bio because I think it's really important and I didn't want to forget anything. So bear with me as I just introduced Dennis a little bit more fully by saying that following his early career in clinical medical practice, Dr. Kendel has served in a diverse array of provincial and national leadership roles. He devoted a total of 29 years to successive service in CEO roles with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Saskatchewan, SaskDocs, and the Health Quality Council. He served in many advisory roles to a succession of provincial governments, culminating in his service on the advisory panel that recommended the consolidation of 12 regional health authorities into the Saskatchewan Health Authority. His service as a federal government appointee to the Health Council of Canada afforded him an opportunity to learn about federal, provincial, territorial working relationships in the health sector. In recognition of his service to the people of Saskatchewan, Dr. Kendel was awarded the Saskatchewan Order of Merit in 2004. If that wasn't enough, during the course of his career, Dr. Kendel has learned much of value about the development and implementation of public policy. Over the past 10 years, he's provided consulting services to governments and non-governmental organizations on policy issues. He has come to understand factors that influence public policy development, as well as factors that both impede and support innovative policy implementation. So on that basis, I am going to hopefully spend quite a bit of our time of our conversation over the next 30 minutes or so talking about some policy things, Dennis. But before I throw it over to you with a few opening questions and comments, I just want to take the soapbox for a minute. I want to reiterate, first of all, that the reimagining or rethinking long-term care and care for older adults in our province was something that really inspired Dennis and I as we had some conversations previous to today. We realized that there's been lots of concentration on what went wrong during this pandemic and what do we need to fix. But we saw that as an opportunity also to say, what did we learn and how do we build from that? So we want to try and keep our eyes a bit on the prize of the future and the vision. I read recently that in a survey done, some huge percentage of older adults or adults in Canada say that they do not want to end up in a nursing home. Their faith in the system, if there was very much of it before, has now been totally shaken by what's happened over the last year. And the second point I'd like to make is something that I encounter all the time when I talk to people about older adults. And that is the misconception that every single one of us as we grow old will end up in a nursing home. Nothing could be further from the truth. While we do have some high institutionalization rates in our province and in this country, in fact, only about 10% of older adults are actually being provided special care in facilities. That means that there are a whole lot of us out there in the community who are aging in place, who are aging perhaps totally well and fully functional, and some getting care from a variety of other places. So let's not make the mistake that the be all and end all of services for older adults, at least in my mind, rests in the idea of long-term care and what we've known for the past more than half a century of the way we care for older adults in Canada. So enough of my soapbox and my ideas about how we get started. I wonder if I could engage with you, Dennis, in a little bit of conversation about what you've seen over the last year, or perhaps even in your career, that makes you think that we need to rethink care for older adults? And some of the eye-openers that you've had even more lately about what we need to keep our eye on as we start thinking about what the future should hold.
Okay, well, thank you, Shan. So I just want to draw some parallels between our personal lives and our collective lives as citizens. In our own lives, sometimes we quite naively go from day to day thinking everything's going to be good forever, and then suddenly we're struck with some devastating illness, and it's a wake-up call. Of course, we have to access care, but also in retrospect, we wish we had perhaps done some things to mitigate the risk of that harm befalling us. And in the collective part of our life as citizens, it's the same thing. We sometimes tolerate an awareness of things that are not as good as they could be, but it sometimes takes a crisis to throw us into action collectively. And the pandemic has created that crisis for us in terms of care of the aging, not just in long-term care, but in the community. And I just want to make the observation that, you know, at the moment, as Randy mentioned, I mean, there's a 3-part series in the Leader Post and Star Phoenix. On Monday, Andre Picard released this amazing book. It's under 200 pages. It's a paperback. It's called Neglected No More. I would urge you to get a copy and read it. It's a powerful testament to what has been missing in our system and how we need to change it. And then I just want to recall a bit of history about how I perceive change being leveraged in public policy. Back in 1999, an agency in the US called the Institute of Medicine did a chart review of people dying in US hospitals, and discovered hard evidence that up to 98,000 people per year in US hospitals died from human error. Now, they might have been quite ill, but they didn't die from their illness. They died because things were done wrongly. And that was a wake-up call to the world, really, literally, that much of care was unsafe. So it triggered reactions in Canada. An agency called the Patient Safety Institute was created. And it's interesting, in part, that also triggered the government in Saskatchewan to create the Commission on Medicare in 2001. And Ken Fike is actually on the call with us. Ken was the appointed commissioner. He was living in BC at the time, but he had been a past Deputy Minister of Health, and he was brought back to do this work. And here's a hard copy of the Commission on Medicare report. I read it almost every night, Ken, to reassure myself that it is possible to change public policy. So among the recommendations of the Commission on Medicare was the creation of an agency called the Health Quality Council. The legislation to establish it was passed in 2002, and the agency was set up in 2003. And I was privileged to be appointed to the board of that agency, and indeed served on the board from 2003 to 2015. And one of the amazing things that we got to do as board members was to travel to places where there were perceived high-performing healthcare systems and to study how they work better, and then come back and try and apply those lessons in Saskatchewan. And it's interesting, as I read the document that was circulated in advance of this meeting from the Seniors Mechanism, I mean, you've clearly done some excellent research on better public policy about care for the aging in Denmark, the Netherlands, Australia. And that's a very good way to put that evidence into the public arena and foster discourse and hopefully action. But I do want to point out that you know, we have short crisis news cycles, and you're going to have to be persistent in bringing these messages to the public and making it impossible for government to ignore them. And I will have some thoughts to share with you a little later on about how you might do that.
That's a great way to get started, Dennis, but I'm wondering too about ageism. The whole idea that you mentioned the errors that were made, some of the things that we've learned about the way care is delivered for older adults. Certainly, have we not seen this undercurrent of ageism? Even to our horror, hearing people say during COVID that older adults are dying at a faster rate than anybody else. A huge percentage, actually, of our deaths are older adults, especially those in long-term care, but that they were going to die anyway. I hate even saying it out loud because it sounds diminishing to a huge portion of our population. Have you seen in your practice and in some of the readings that you've done this ageism thread? And are there ways that we could start tackling that as well?
Absolutely. In fact, I was absolutely shocked watching TV or a clip from TV to see the premier of one of our neighboring provinces state that the average life expectancy in that province was whatever the number is, and saying that most of the people dying from COVID was lost because they lived longer than they had a right to expect to. And that is just horrible ageism. So ageism is a factor we need to deal with. And I just find it interesting, when we set up Medicare in 1962, and then when it went national, we didn't at that time say, well, maybe parents should just look after kids themselves if they get sick or whatever. And we assumed that the whole population would be looked after in terms of whatever their needs would be. And there is unfortunately an inclination to regard aging people as somehow not deserving of the same degree of public support as we provide to other age sectors. That is unfortunate.
Right. Right. And I remember also at the very beginning of the pandemic, several noted geriatricians and even I think Andre Picard were saying, if I were a family member, I would rush in and take my older adult out of care. Yes. And as a person who had been a primary caregiver for my mother for so many years in long-term care, and acquainted with many members of our family councils and people in the long-term care network, who had to make that very difficult choice. It isn't something that's as easily done now because I would say that had I been capable, I would have cared for my mother in an alternate setting. But the long-term care was one that we had to turn to when the resources of my family and the network of other kinds of services in the community just weren't enough. In particular, I meet a lot of people who are caregivers for those with dementia or cognitive decline, and realize that while it isn't, as I've said earlier in this conversation, the end of the only way that all of us end up, it does have an importance in the whole continuum. And it's on the continuum that I think maybe we need to spend our time. What kinds of home care services, what kind of assisted living, what kind of housing alternatives would there be if we looked at using our funding a little bit differently to spread it out across a bigger continuum?
My wife and I were privileged to act at age 95, and we had a design suite for her, and she was quite remarkably self-reliant for all of those years, other than our being her social support. And sadly, then in the last year and a half of her life, we were not able to continue because of the deterioration in her health, and she spent the last year and a half in long-term care. But we learned a lot of things, I think, about just even the social support importance. And it's interesting, my wife was raising with me some conversation about some ideas now to arrange for people to essentially share housing, just using their own resources. A good friend of mine is thinking of selling her house and two people moving together in a house. They're both alone. And there's lots of innovative things we can and should be thinking of. And then the question is, to what extent do we do that? If we can afford it ourselves, we just do it on our own. But if we can't, then we need assistance from our tax base.
And what about that? I mean, I've been a long proponent of the whole idea of equity. Yeah. The fact that, we have millionaires in our midst and we have people who live below the poverty line. Yeah. How do we build a system that provides access to those who are in greatest need and doesn't exclude huge portions of that older population saying you're on your own. It's up to you to figure it out, because we all have families or money that can purchase what it is we need when we need it. When you were looking even at the health region redistribution and the idea of forming a health authority, when you were at the Health Quality Council, did the whole issue of accessibility and equity come up?
Okay, well, it's interesting. I mean, people have different people view equity in different terms, but as I read the paper distributed in advance of this session, I was really pleased that you had done the economic analysis that by and large, it's more cost effective to provide care in the community as long as you possibly can. So it's interesting. I just served as the CEO of the Health Quality Council for 17 months on an interim basis when they, lost a CEO and took that long to find a successor. But it's interesting. The first month that I took on that role, the board made a decision to focus on the social determinants of health, to move upstream, as it were, rather than just on health care. And so that involves obviously things like employment, poverty, education, food security, housing security. And there's absolutely no doubt that if we just talk about housing, for instance, if your brain is wired on economics and cost effectiveness, there's overwhelming research showing that providing housing to people who, for whatever reason in life, can't afford it and are homeless is infinitely less costly than having them live on the streets and be dependent, popping into emergency departments very frequently, and all the other things that come with homelessness. So I do think, particularly in Saskatchewan, we have a government right now that's very focused on economic arguments. And we sometimes think that people who have concerns about equity are bleeding hearts of some sort. Couldn't be further from the truth. There's strong economic arguments to approach equity and aging with a view to being not just compassionate to our fellow citizens, but actually being cost effective.
Right. And I remember when I worked in the health region, and we looked at some opportunities, instead of spending what at that time, and that was 10 years ago, would be a cost upfront of about $400,000 for creating one long-term care bed, and a huge amount of money for staffing and maintaining that bed, the buildings that we have, the capital investment. If we took even a portion of that, and either one of the innovative programs we had gave it to families in order to enable them to put together their own care plan, or invested in things like you're talking about, home care, assisted living, housing alternatives. And that's where I go back to the whole idea of a continuum. And as I look, as a single person who doesn't necessarily assume, rightly or wrongly, that I have a spouse who's going to be involved in my care, then some of that thinking about how does my sister, my best friend, work with me for us to come up with a plan for aging for myself that isn't automatically a long-term care bed somewhere. And if I could just share one other memory I have of a good friend of mine years and years ago, when we built a new long-term care facility in Saskatoon, and I took him for a little tour before it opened. And everyone was looking around and saying, isn't this lovely, very nice, beautiful lobby, lovely rooms with a view. And my friend, who is a bit of a cynic, said to me, well, yeah, that's all well and good. This is a nice place. But he said, not one single person visiting here says, I can hardly wait till I need this. And that is absolutely true. So how do we make some palatable options for all of us that combine all of the best we can in the system?
I just also want to mention that, community groups play a big role in terms of providing social support, to people in the community for whatever their needs might be. And it's really interesting in the midst of this pandemic. My wife and I are members of a church congregation, which is very predominantly older than us. My wife and I are both 74 years old. We don't feel old, but 74 is 74. But it's really interesting. We've started these Zoom chat groups for people who never knew how to use any virtual meeting apps before, but we've all taken on responsibility in the congregation to reach out to people. coach them how to, so many of them have a cell phone, how to use a cell phone. Yesterday, I was on a chat group with about 10 men. It was deliberately organized as men, and it was organized for them to just share how they're doing in the COVID and to ask questions of me about how the vaccination process is going to go to work. And I just got a sense of joy participating in that Zoom meeting because people were so happy to be socially connected, and I happened to be a resource that could give them some useful information. And so I think a lot of that stuff happens organically in communities and service organizations. It isn't that we have to, have the government do everything, but the government at the end of the day is us. We pay our taxes. And as a citizen, I'd be happy to pay more taxes in Saskatchewan to make sure that everybody could be supported in the community. And then that's just something I think we all need to commit to.
Right. And as well, I'm conscious of our time here, but there's been lots of talk lately too about the standards of care,
yes,
and the people who are employed in long-term care, and how perhaps we need to change and look at our focus on that. The story I tell in that regard is my niece, when she was training 10 years ago as to be a nurse, decided early on that she wanted to spend her time in geriatrics, in long-term care, and that her dream job would be in long-term care. And she was literally discouraged by her professors, by other students who said, why would a good student like you, someone who has promise for being a great nurse, want to spend your time in long-term care? So shifting ideas, but also those standards of care. Who is it that works in long-term care? How do we have teams of people? And I know you've done a lot of work on not only gender equity kinds of things in medicine, but also interprofessional teams, groupings of professionals who can bring the best of each profession. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, absolutely. You need a team approach, and certainly not only in long-term care, but in home care. I mean, there's quite a diverse array of people who can bring skills to support people in their homes. I do think also, just commenting on ageism, it's really interesting that we have infinitely more pediatricians in medicine than we do have geriatricians. For a long time in this province, we had one Royal College certified geriatrician, Jenny Bassaran, and optimally to use her skills best, she eventually became a resource to teaching family doctors how to, better care for aging people. But I do think that sadly, in many disciplines, my own being medicine, there was infinitely more honor paid to people who rescue people from the threat of death. So it's pulling people out of the river makes you a hero. Figuring out how to prevent people from falling into the river isn't as sexy. And so, it's interesting. By and large, you earn a way lot more money as a surgeon than you do as a geriatrician. And I often tease some of my surgeon colleagues, particularly orthopedic surgeons. They use tools pretty much like you pick up Canadian Tire. I mean, they're tradespeople when you're working on bones, where in geriatrician, you're working with people's lives in a more sophisticated way. So I better shut up, but that's.
Yeah, and I think that with my experience with my own mother in care, some of the best caregivers were those who had relational skills.
Yes.
They were people who respected older adults, who took the time to pay an interest in who my mother was as a person, rather than seeing their sole job as getting her out of bed and sitting in a chair, getting her to the toilet, getting her dressed, getting her fed. They saw her as a whole person. And those relational skills are not something that we traditionally reward people for, both in the pay factor, as you've mentioned, but also in the emphasis we put on quality of life, as opposed to a simple health or medical approach to people just needing that custodial maintenance care, as if long-term care were hospitals light.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, and probably that's the last thing, because I think our time is running out, is that, I admire the spirit and culture within the Indigenous community in which the elders are honored and it's a privilege to, you know, hear their stories and to learn from them. And they are seen as a source of wisdom as opposed to people who are on the decline. And just another piece of good news, Dr. Alika LaFontaine, who grew up in Saskatchewan in Treaty 4 territory, graduated from the University of Saskatchewan. He's now in Alberta, but he's been elected as the president of the Canadian Medical Association, starting office in August, the first Indigenous physician to serve in this role. I know Alika personally, and he is committed to actually bringing some of those values to our caring system, that we don't, you know, take this sort of dismissive approach to elders. You know. Anyway,
right.
I think we have to wrap up, don't we?
I think we do, but I'm going to ask you for one final comment, because we've given kind of a potpourri of ideas for people to think about as they start rethinking the system. Policy, and you mentioned a little bit at the beginning. Who do we have to influence the most? Who should be our targets for trying to get change created? Yeah,
well, we have two health ministers, and Everett Hindley is the minister responsible for seniors. So obviously he'll be front and center, but I don't think you just stop with that minister. You have to reach out to the cabinet basically. And you know, Ken Fike could tell you a lot about the internal dynamics in government, about how you need to get the, you know, the attention of decision makers. I will just give one final suggestion. The Health Quality Council is an organization that I'm deeply committed to and highly respect. It is a very effective organization. It has an annual budget of about $4.5 million. It has about 50 staff, including very skilled researchers and people who know how to influence public policy. And I think the seniors mechanism and its, you know, 18 members or and other members ought to approach the Health Quality Council about doing something jointly, because it is an agency that actually does get the attention of government, and it does have some really skilled people who can help influence public policy. So there's a tip.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. I'm going to turn it back to Holly now, but hopefully you and I both have sparked a little bit more creative thinking, and people who, as they go into their small groups, will have some ideas and come out with some creative thoughts for us. And I think with some time, you and I may be allowed to have a final word right at the end. We'll keep our fingers crossed, but we also encourage people to spend time thinking